This is Bob Ferguson, and you have wandered into another episode of Life with Bob, where every Monday night at 8 p.m. on Central Time, where I have wonderful people to interview. Tonight, it is my very, very great pleasure to have my good friend and colleague and someone who I really respect, Russ Concert. So Russ was a petroleum engineer for 15 years, and then for another 15 years, ran the Game Changer program at Shell Oil. Basically, in charge of all of the innovation, all of the innovative kind of skunkworks projects for Shell Oil across the world. And then he attended a TED Talk, found out about recarbonization of the soil. And Russ, I'm going to let you take it from there because the storyline after that is really extraordinary. And just a moment more. So what we're going to be talking about is Russ's experience and then looking at what are we going to do with the climate crisis? Because it's not enough to reduce emissions. We really have to take some of the carbon that we put in the atmosphere out. So with that introduction, Russ, it's delightful having you with us here.
Hey, Bob. Yeah, I'm not sure extraordinary, but unusual maybe. And hope it's extraordinary before we're done. Yes, I mean, you asked me to chat this evening about what I wish everyone knew.
Yep.
That's a really dangerous question with a guy like me, but maybe I'll take folks on a journey. So yeah, indeed, as you said, Bob, I spent 30 years in the energy industry because I saw that energy was the thing that made the world go around when I was a child of the 70s, the age of the energy crises and so on. And I had the privilege of spending the first half of a 30-year career looking for carbon. I guess we didn't frame it that way all around the world and bringing it to market, and got to learn a lot about the world and see a lot of corners of the world. And then the second half of that, my day job was finding better ways to either do that or to replace it. So investing in not only better oil and gas technologies, but alternative energy technologies from biofuels to solar to wind to nuclear, et cetera. And so really had the privilege of kind of being on the forefront of energy. And indeed, as you said, that there was a really important red thread through all of that said that, yeah, the carbon problem, actually, it's important to fix our energy system, but it's not enough. So should we jump into the presentation part, Bob?
Sure, that'd be great.
All right, let's see if we can get this to work right. And we'll get this going. And let's see if that works. Are you seeing it all?
Yes. We're
all right.
Doing this thing.
So I'm going to take you on what I think is kind of an unusual or unexpected journey through a line of reasoning. And I thought I'd just spell out the red thread up front here and then go through. And we're going to look at a bunch of charts and graphs, which are really interesting to scientific folks like me, but may get confusing. I'm going to try to weave an energy story that starts with energy at literally the big picture of energy in the universe. So. And what the universe is trying to do is spread energy, and life helps it do that. That all of that energy starts with sunlight or stars in the case of nuclear energy. I want to remind people of something that we forget about, that we wouldn't be here today without all of that old sunshine, fossil energy as we call it. But we really don't have a very attractive future if we don't do a better job of it. So the transition to low carbon energy is well underway. I know that's not visible to a lot of people, but we'll look at some of that. But it's also not good enough. So we must remove current CO2 from the air or the planet will go on heating. The irony is that the answer to our problems, I believe, lies in the power of life itself, where life stores most of the carbon in the soil, and our opportunity is to put that carbon back in the soil. So I'm going to float up. If there's kind of a 50,000 foot view, this is more like a 50,000 mile view or something. It's really high level, but I think it's helpful to think of planet Earth as a living organism that takes energy in from the sun and it sheds energy out the other side. I'll spare the technical details. We know from conservation of energy that in general, it's largely in balance, but the energy going out is a lower grade energy or more spread out, more dispersed than the energy coming in. And that turns out to be important. Now we're going to zoom down into kind of the 50,000 foot level at the economy, and the thing a lot of people talk about. And I think this is the conversation that got us started, Bob,
Yes.
here in trying to understand what's going on in renewable energy, because a lot of people don't see this because it's kind of in the noise for most folks. So what you're looking at here is a chart of the fraction of the US electricity production only. So this doesn't include transport or any other CO2 emission sources. But this is just a percentage of our energy that's produced from solar and wind. On the left is what I call what we notice. This is a linear scale. This is how you and I tend to feel things in the real space. And you'll notice that the percentage of energy that's renewable is down there all below 10%. And I'll come back to that light blue line here in a minute. If you look over to the right-hand side, we can use some mathematical tricks to do some comparisons, and we can see we can take that small little thing down below and turn it into a straight line on a type of a log plot where we see it behaves really well. And the thing I want to draw your attention to is the projection you see in that straight light blue line is a projection I made back in 2009.
Wow.
Actually, I made it in 2010 using data from 1998 to 2009. And at the time, I put on there the official DOE projections done in 2009 as well. Those are the black squares. And you'll see what's actually played out since then is really darn close to the projection I made 10 years ago. And if you put that back over on the left chart, that's the light blue line, where you could see that would imply that we would reach a 50% penetration of renewable energy in our power system, potentially as early as 2027. So less than 10 years from now, which most people find remarkable, but this is how S curves work. Now, they don't always work this way. Come on. My computer seems to have locked up, Bob.
Sometimes if you click on the slide and then use your arrow buttons, it works.
We're going to have to.
Sometimes not.
Right, I've lost my mouse completely at the moment.
Okay, well, if you have to
it'll take a
reboot,
second.
we're good.
What you'll see on the next slide when we get control back here is the same kind of data for nuclear power. And what you'll see there is, oh, there we go, went way too far.
Okay, so it's
we're going to get this back now.
Yeah.
I know what it's doing. Okay, you seeing the charts again?
Okay, yeah.
All right, so this is the nuclear power curve, and this is separate data plotted on the same scale for the United States and France with nuclear power. And you see how the US curve follows this nice curve for a while, and then the US kind of goes off to the right in a straight line. But France stays on exactly the same line. And what this would say is that the US and France were going through the same kind of energy transition, but effectively the US opted out of nuclear energy in immediate aftermath of 3 Mile Island. But the French, who said, we're going to keep going, kept going on the same curve. And you can see that linear curve continued on until they reached over 70% of their energy system. Now, this is data that I just plotted up a few weeks ago, and I think this is the data that precipitated our conversation, Bob.
Right.
Where there's a common understanding today that if renewable energy is still just a niche. And when I saw this data, this came from the BP Annual Statistical Review of Energy. And if you see over here on the left is all of the energy mix for the entire world. So not just for the United States, not just for power. But see that little tiny green wedge at the top? See how you can start noticing it just in the last few years?
Yep.
Other people get frustrated because they say that's really tiny. But when I go look at that data in my logarithmic space, what I can see is these same linear patterns happening. And really what we can see is that transition to renewable energy on a global scale has been accelerating rapidly since 2006. Now, it's still highly uncertain. Maybe that's an anomaly and it returns back to a lower slope. But at least for the last 10 years, it's been keeping up on a very, very straight line. So what does that mean? Still same format here where we're on, now I've summarized the linear space data for the green line and the blue line from the prior chart on the left. What it would mean is that 50% of the world's energy mix could be renewable by the year 2040 and 90% by 2060. I think most people would feel really excited about that because that feels faster than you would expect for something that's only about 5% of the world energy mix now. But it could also be as slow as 50% by 2075 if it kind of returned to a lower slope in time. But here's the so what on the right. What I call the harsh reality. If I take the optimistic data on the left, you see that red curve on the right? That's the total CO2 emissions that would be implied by that green curve on the left. And I guess I skipped over it here, but if you look at the area of the black and the green down below, that's basically the proportion in the total world energy mix that's continuing to increase. The black is non-renewable and the green is renewable. So if we have a very, very simple model that says the black continues to produce CO2, but the green doesn't, the red curve is the projected CO2 footprint. Now, the harsh reality that most people don't think about is see that area I'm pointing to with the black arrow where it says minimum new CO2? Yeah. That means that even if we convert our energy economy at lightning speed in a very optimistic scenario, all of this area between that dotted vertical line and that dashed kind of curved line is new CO2 that will be emitted into the atmosphere. And it's really hard to get more optimistic than that.
Yep.
And in the next slide, this is a chart from a 2017 paper that says, let's just assume we have a completely vertical line, like we could turn off all the CO2 tomorrow. And what I want to point out here is in this case, oops, I started moving things again accidentally, that the world will continue to warm. That's because we still have a radiative imbalance in incoming solar radiation on planet Earth. So even if we stop emitting all CO2 tomorrow, the Earth will continue to warm. And guess what? Even in an optimistic scenario, we can't stop emitting all CO2 tomorrow.
Right.
So before people get depressed and feel hopeless, the good news is we can actually close the carbon cycle by using the carbon cycle. So the bit that we skipped over when we talked earlier here is when I first started hearing claims of regenerative agriculture, I guess it's about 6 years ago now, I got a hold of some samples from soils under farmers that were practicing what's called regenerative agriculture. And I immediately recognized the quantity and distribution of carbon in those soils to be identical to the source rocks that the oil and gas came from in the first place. And I recognized it because that used to be my day job as a petroleum engineer, was looking at rocks that oil and gas would come out of, including the original source rocks that they were cooked out of. And all of a sudden it became very plausible to me because the processes by which this happens are just the basics of photosynthesis. And what we're really asking nature to do is the same thing that she did millions and millions of years ago, all over again. But this time, we need to work with her to get her to do that. So I'm going to try to explain how that works. For those folks that still remember high school chemistry or biology, you'll remember that photosynthesis is a process by which energy comes in and it helps a plant take CO2 and water and turn it into sugar and oxygen. What a lot of people maybe don't think about is that all life on Earth does one of two things. It either runs that cycle forward, we call that photosynthesis, or it runs that cycle backwards, we call that respiration. You and I do respiration, but so do microbes and any other living organism on the planet. Only primary producers, plants, trees, any other photosynthesizers do the green arrow. But it's this balance between green and red that drives all life on Earth. So many folks in the audience have probably seen the Keeling curve before. It's that chart that you might see on the internet showing CO2 concentrations going up. It kind of has a sawtooth shape. This is a slightly more sophisticated version of that. And I want to explain it to give you a sense of what's going on. So CO2 concentration is the vertical axis. The axis on the left here is going from the South Pole to the North Pole. So this is the southern hemisphere that's not wiggling so much, and this is the northern hemisphere that's got a lot of movement. And then on this axis going left to right is year going from 2007 through 2016, 10 years. So you can see that constant increase. That's what we all know is the increasing atmospheric CO2 problem. But what I want to draw your attention to is these up and down cycles, especially in the northern hemisphere, where most of the planet's land mass is. And that's this cycle of respiration and photosynthesis going on that we just talked about on the last page. So in the summer, the CO2 concentration goes down as the Earth inhales and does a lot of photosynthesis. And as it breathes back out in the winter, CO2 concentrations go up. So you get this big oscillating swing going on. Mm-hmm. What is important to understand is the magnitude of that imbalance that's kind of the trend going up is this little tiny red sliver over here on this chart on the left. The amount of total carbon in the atmosphere is in blue, the amount in plants and other life on Earth is in green, and all of the carbon in the soil is in brown. So this process of respiration and photosynthesis that you saw on the last slide is only slightly out of balance. If we include the respiration that we do by burning fossil fuels in that picture, we're letting more CO2 out than we're taking up each year. The other thing I want to point to on the right, because you could see in that prior picture that all that photosynthesis was happening over land, is this is a map of a pie for the entire planet Earth. And the land that we humans manage to grow food are this orange and purple areas over here, farmland and pasture land being the largest fraction of it. So now I'm going to dig into what's probably a counterintuitive story for folks, but it turns out that there's a really symbiotic relationship between cows and grass that's very similar to bees and flowers that most people understand. In other words, if the animal interacts with its environment in a healthy way, both the animal and the environment prosper. The magic, and it's kind of a long explanation, is to manage animals on ecosystems in a way that replicates or mimics the patterns of how animals would have interacted with that landscape in the era past. So what we do today typically on those pasture lands is we throw animals out in a pasture and we let them eat. But what would typically happen in the past is animals would stay close together, cluster up and move around frequently and never come back to the same place very often. That allowed grass to grow, but it also allowed carbon to be pumped into the ground. This slide here is a chart from several different ranches across the southeastern US showing carbon going up year after year in response to changing of grazing management practices. So I want to drive home this point using the same pictures as before, that if the organic matter is going up, what it means is that the land is operating in a way that the photosynthesis arrow is bigger than the respiration arrow, and we're by definition getting a net CO2 sink going on in that ecosystem. The other thing that's important to realize is that when we have healthier soil, we're able to grow more grass and a better quality of grass. So the productivity for the farmer goes up as well. So it turns out to be a prosperous proposition for farmers who understand this as well. Now I want to translate it back into the language that I started with. Cows help grass spread solar energy so more life prospers. That's connecting it back to that first picture of sunlight coming into planet Earth. And more life prospers due to the accumulation of carbon in living soil. Now, how much is it? Does it really matter? Well, it turns out if you just do some back of the envelope math, really big caution on the uncertainties on this. But the net carbon being captured, you can see on the left here, this is a recent paper out of Michigan State University, is more than the CO2 equivalents that are being emitted in the process of cattle production. And if you kind of do a little bit of math to compare how much that might add up to, it would amount to, if replicated on all US pasture land, about 20% of US emissions, or in comparison to other things that we might understand, it would be the equivalent of taking about 75% of our oil production out of the equation, or roughly taking all the cars off the road or all the homes off the grid, or building as much wind capacity as 7 times US current wind capacity. So turns out it could be a really big lever. This is a slide summarizing a recent study that was done by a third-party carbon quantification company called Qantas on a regenerative pasture in Georgia. Once again, demonstrating, similar to the Michigan State paper, that it was a carbon negative beef production system. And although it may sound provocative to people, for all the enthusiasm and excitement about trying to create better forms of alternative meats, they're all still just doing a little less bad for the environment, whereas regenerative agriculture can create this net sink or a net good. So that's what I've turned my attention to now. We've started this company that you would have seen the slide on page 1, and I think you shared with your folks earlier, to try to bring beef that's been produced this way to people starting here this fall. So I'll wrap up the presentation part here with this final slide to bring it all together. What I really wish everyone knew was that to fix the challenges of energy and carbon, we need to do 2 things. We have to keep renewable energy transformation going, and we have to start a transformation to create this renewable food system. This renewable food system can store carbon, and it also has a bunch of other positive benefits, several of which I've listed here, that are goods as well. So with that, I think I'll draw the presentation to a close and take your questions, Bob, and from your friends.
Great. So I am looking at my Facebook feed. So if anyone is watching on Facebook, and there are quite a few, if you have questions, just pop them in the comments and I should be able to see them. So Russ, let's talk about the fascinating way that you have evolution since you started with a company called Standard Soil, which I thought was an impossibly apt name, just really, really wonderful. But then you had an issue of how do you actually translate this theoretical knowledge into a business model that actually works. And so through a very unique relationship with Audubon Society, connecting with what you said, that when you do things when you do things in harmony with nature, you get a whole bunch of side benefits, as opposed to when you break laws of nature, you get a whole bunch of side effects. And most of those effects are nasty surprises. So when you looked at how do we get a quality product to market in a way that people will pay attention to it, and at the same time build relationships between organizations that, raising beef cattle and bird habitat, I'm guessing, doesn't really necessarily go together in most times. So
Great. For most folks.
Because this is, I'm utterly fascinated with the science there. I think I'm going to, I'll definitely run a watch party again. So everyone who's watching, hang on, because when we're done, I'll run it again, because I definitely need to run those numbers again. But let's talk about the practical way, or first of all, what are the synergistic benefits? Let's talk a little bit more about what really happens. Is it really good? Because there's a lot of people who firmly believe, as I did, that we're just really going to have to stop eating animal products because the carbon emissions is just too much. Where in point of fact, all the data that we're using now shows that actually by raising beef cattle in this particular way, you actually get that 3%, negative carbon,
Right.
which means carbon going into the soil. Tell us about that magic.
Yeah, and so the catchphrase that I've used that seems to work for folks now is to tell people it's not the cow, it's the how. And again, going back to that 50,000-mile view of Earth and as an energy system, um, when the cow is not functioning rightly in its ecosystem, indeed some negative things happen, and especially when they're amplified by our human foolishness of using additional toxins and other things that only make matters worse. But when the cow is operating rightly within its ecosystem, it's helping the ecosystem to capture more of that incoming solar energy. And it's able to do that only because it's building the capacity of the ecosystem to do it. That is because of the healthy living microbiology in the soil, where the animal interacting with the plant is acting kind of like a carbon pump. The magic, a lot of the technical details that I left out here are how the plant and the roots of the plant interact with microbes to build that carbon and get it going. So it's really interesting technically, and there's some really interesting things that are going on for measuring that carbon, for measuring the improvement in water and measuring the improvement in ecosystems, but it's really, really hard to communicate. And so our world started to change here this last summer. We'd actually been working in various capacities with the National Audubon Society, because very separately from this, they'd come to the realization, and I don't know how many folks, Bob, if you noticed this big report out of Cornell here the week before last about bird loss in the United States. We're down 3 billion birds over the last 7 years.
I caught that and felt the sting of that.
Right. Yeah, indeed. And we've got that old adage of canary in the coal mine, right? That the birds are somehow there to warn us of catastrophe.
Yeah.
But this kind of delayed, long, slow, silent spring, if we can use Rachel Carson's famous words.
Yeah.
I don't think we really saw it unfolding because it was like the boiling frog in the pot type thing. So what you may not have noticed from that Cornell study was that the grassland birds were the most imperiled class in that, down 53% since 1947.
Wow.
And that's attributed to our industrial farming system, which has done three things: just remove the habitat completely. It's brought killer machinery into the system and killer pesticides that not only kill the birds, but kill the food that the birds eat.
Yeah.
And so entirely separately from this carbon story, the Audubon folks had come to the realization that in order to bring back grassland birds, they had to figure out a way to restore grasslands and this habitat that had been destroyed and sprayed and run over with machinery. And they came to the realization that working with the largest private landowners of grasslands was the way they had to do that. And that inevitably led them to ranchers, people producing beef cattle, because that's the largest by far use of grasslands in North America, and frankly, anywhere in the world.
Right.
And so there's a lot of the superficial story on birds that a lot of people don't recognize is birds are very habitat specialists. And if you have a very smooth, flat ecosystem, there's no place for the birds that like short grass or tall grass to live. You get one or the other, but not both. What happens when you graze in a way that mimics nature, you get this diversity of structure and habitat and diversity of plant life that creates the bird habitat coming back. What was a little less visible to them at this time was the recognition that the food pyramid that fed that system started down with the healthy soil. So literally the same grazing practices that are creating the bird habitat above the ground are creating the base of the bird food pyramid underneath the ground. And so our own journey here with the standard soil thing and the launch of this new Blue Nest beef product, which is just literally, I mean, you can reserve it now, but it's not going to start shipping here for a few more weeks, was a recognition that the Audubon folks had already enrolled 1.8 million acres of grasslands in following these protocols to bring back bird habitat. But they didn't really have a good way to get that product to market at a national scale yet. There's some really good folks that are farmers selling regionally and locally. A few are starting to ship, and that's wonderful. But the problem was, how do we get this to people in New York City and Boston and Miami and Peoria and Los Angeles, right? You know, it's how do we get that? So what we've done here is recognize that the Audubon folks also had a relationship with several million people who were self-professed bird lovers who wanted to be involved in creating that habitat. So Blue Nest Beef is basically closing the gap in the Audubon story between the 1.8 million acres and the several million consumers with a supply chain that will bring beef that's doing good things for birds back to consumers who want to make a choice with their food that has a positive impact on ecosystems. And the bird is kind of the symbol. The little hashtag I probably should have put on here was "Birds Tell Us." It's back to that canary in the coal mine thing.
Mm-hmm.
When the birds return to the habitat, it tells us that there's more carbon in the soil. It tells us that the pollinators are back. It tells us that the insects and the beetles below the ground are back. It tells us that the habitat structure above the ground is back. And so the birds are literally, you know, instead of the canary in the coal mine, it's the meadowlark in the prairie, right? It's this concept that the birds are really a wonderful signal that we've kind of started down the right path of restoring ecosystems again.
Well, I'll tell you, Russ, I think what we're going to do is maybe let everyone digest this for a little bit. And then a couple of months from now, what I'd like to do is come back and let's dig into this soil, microbe, cattle, you know, that the whole basically.
Right. It's very non-intuitive. I get it, Bob. Yeah.
the bison prairie ecology that actually Francis Ticky here, as you know.
Right. Francis is one of the best farmers in the country. He's right there in Fairfield.
He's right here in Fairfield, and was researcher at USDA, PhD in soil fertility. Comes from a dairying family, and came back after he decided he didn't want to live in Washington D.C. anymore, and bought a dairy that was struggling. And over the last more than 25 years, he has taken land and actually expanded, bought more land.
Right.
Basically taken land that was so eroded that it was down to the red subsoil. It was land that never should have been row farmed, far too steep. And in that time, built an extraordinary amount of topsoil back there and utilizes exactly the mechanics that you're talking about. The cow's hooves punch through the cows. What he does is, I'd be interested how this translates to beef cattle. What he does is he milks there's probably 60, 80 heads, something like that. And so the cows get milked and they go down the lane, and there are 60 paddocks he's got that are 1 acre paddocks that are just separated by an inexpensive electric fence run by a solar panel.
Right, solar charger. Yep.
Yeah, and so the cows come down. He just opens one of the paddocks. The cows going in, and it's the darndest thing you've ever seen.
Right.
I saw them the other day, and they were kind of all over the place. But one time I saw them all lined up like a big brown lawnmower, and just kind of eat and poop, in lockstep down the paddock. And so when they're done, they go back to get milked. That paddock closes up, and that paddock isn't grazed for another 60 days, in which grass grows up. And it's really an extraordinary, if you were going to come back.
Yeah, it's this picture here.
Yeah.
Basically, what Francis is doing is he's using those small paddocks and electric fences to replicate the forces that nature would have provided in the past. Yeah. Those forces would have been forage availability seasonally. Hey, there's better grass over there. Let's go there.
Yep.
And predatory pressure, right? Which says, hey, let's keep moving. Let's stay close together and make it move. So what Francis and other farmers like him have done is replicated that process in their local context. Now with Francis, because he's a dairyman, right? So he's got to bring those animals back to the barn to get milked with pretty high frequency. Those cattle can't get too far distance-wise from the barn, but a beef cattle farmer can, right? Because they only need to get back to the truck at the end of their life cycle,
right?
To make it work. So the extensiveness of the beef cattle production system can go quite a bit further, but it's the same basic principles going on. And the cow is acting as this catalyzer of that photosynthetic process, right? Which
Right.
is that stimulating the uptake of solar energy that gets caught by grass and then cycled in that ecosystem.
Cycles through their digestive system into manure, into the ground that drives that carbon back in the ground, right?
Yeah, and well, the carbon in the ground is kind of a symptom of the rest of the ecosystem functioning well. And I realize this will sound perhaps like a little Greek, but referring back to that energy chart of the planet, when I started, maybe over time it sinks in with folks, is that what Earth is trying to do with life is maximize the flow of energy by minimizing the distance that we have to cycle nutrients.
Mm-hmm.
And the shorter we can close those paths, the better we can get at helping life on Earth do what life on Earth wants to do, which is capture sunshine and grow. So kind of shortening these material loops or the mass loops in order to maximize the throughput of energy in life on Earth is kind of what it's all about. And then the carbon that gets stored in the soil is a sign that you're on the right path, because that's the thing that makes that increased cycling happen. Because what's really going on down there is the microbes are mining all those nutrients and recycling them and bringing them back to the plant roots, so the plant can have what it needs to grow.
Are the workers. They're the life. They're the critters under the soil, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's the thing that we don't see, but they're just the cornerstone of the whole thing.
Yeah, it's great. My Uncle Carl was William Albrecht's grad student in the 1930s. And Albrecht was the grandfather, sort of the progenitor of biology-based soil fertility. So all this is very Russ.
So it would have been intuitive to William Albrecht, and he articulated it very well. I think we now have the luxury of having some additional amazing science to understand the details that he might have only dreamed of at that time.
Right.
But the principles people like him had down 70, 80 years ago.
Yeah, because they were documenting a 50% reduction in northern Missouri, 50% reduction in calcium in northern Missouri soils in the early 1940s, and that's before industrial agriculture ever really got going.
Yeah, what I didn't appreciate, Bob, growing up, so I guess we skipped that. I grew up in Nebraska, went to school in Iowa, as you know. Mm-hmm. As an engineer, I just didn't really think much about soils, except for a place where there were trails that I could go hiking over. I just didn't give it much thought. I knew we had these wonderful, luxurious black topsoils in the region, but I didn't realize that they were there because of these forces like the tall grass prairies and the roaming bison. I think, without even thinking of it, I kind of thought, well, maybe all these rich, dark topsoils of Nebraska and Iowa were brought in from Canada on the glaciers. It never occurred to me where they came in Canada. But
how did that happen?
How did that happen? Exactly. I don't think I really thought it through. Yeah, but now I appreciate this symbiotic relationship between cows and grass and soil that, like I say, it's like bees and flowers. People understand bees and flowers. And now I think we have to develop an understanding of how this grazing ruminant, is what we call it technically, has an important fundamental relationship that makes the whole system work.
You know, it's fascinating that in the last ice age, 12,000 years ago, the glaciers actually came south as far as Des Moines.
Right.
In fact, there's called the Des Moines Lobe,
right.
Where actually Fairfield, just 100 miles east, didn't have that.
We didn't get it over there.
We would have felt the coolness of it, but we didn't have the mile of ice. So when those glaciers retreated, there was nothing but rock. So 12,000 years ago, there was just rock. The 8 to 10 feet of topsoil, in the Iowa prairie, was built over that period of time by this microbial action, acids etching the rock, releasing the minerals and lichens and all that kind of cool stuff. So Bruce Deggy has a question. He said, great presentation. Would we produce as many cows as now with this approach? The cow density looks a lot lower than a CAFO. confined animal feeding
Well,
operation.
it's lower than a CAFO, but it's way higher on average across the total system. So back to this chart. See the left chart there where it says stocking rate?
Yeah.
This is the number of cows per acre that you can see change, and this is a function of the fact that you can grow more grass. So if you keep your cows together and move them frequently and the soil gets healthier, you grow more grass, which grows healthier soil, which grows more grass. You get into this do loop of increasing stuff, and you can see that we can increase overall stocking rate by a factor of 2 or 3x. The other thing that maybe is, I know Bruce will understand it, but that because that grass is more nourishing, the animals are healthier and they put on weight faster. So the total productivity per acre goes up even faster than the carrying capacity per acre, because an animal doesn't have to spend as much time there to get to the same weight. So I personally know farmers that have gone anywhere, they've increased their total productivity anywhere from 3 to 5x using these kind of methods. It'll vary by region.
Right.
And so, I don't want people to overextend any implications, but it's one of the things that allows us to say, I mean, we just haven't done what I would call the spatially explicit analysis yet to try to estimate what this would do at a national scale.
Right.
If you go to our old Standard Soil website, which is still active, I have a blog post there from my partner, Alan Williams, of can we finish grass-fed beef at scale, that people can find. And Alan went through some back of the envelope math that said, yes, we can still produce at least as much beef as we do today in the United States using these methods without a CAFO anywhere. Now, wide uncertainties on those numbers and where is the ceiling, I don't know that we know. But we do know that it's these methods have this positive feedback effect, which greatly enhance our overall production capacity of grasslands. It's really kind of it's kind of the ultimate cheat on cows and grass, because what we've done, gosh, what did your the gentleman that you had on your Life with Bob last week?
Valentine.
Yeah, he had a nice little way of saying we had a take, make, and leave model or something.
The typical model in the industrial world is take, make, waste.
Yeah, take, make, waste. I like the way he said it. Take, make, waste.
And most products become waste either hours or days after they're used. So in other words, it's the ultimate open loop, open system where at some point, if you just do take, make, waste, and it's an open system, you're going to run out of stuff. You have to close the loop, right?
That's exactly right. So now if we take that take, make, waste cycle, we close the loop where the waste becomes the input to the make, right? That's what this regenerative agriculture does. So we can amplify that loop and getting it go more to go faster, better, stronger, whatever you want to think of there. That's what makes this work really, is that we're shortening those feedback loops and we're closing them. We're not, as an old engineer, we would make those kind of what you would call the take, make, waste things. And those things that were the waste things, that was just somebody else's problem, right?
Well, yeah, that wasn't your problem.
Exactly.
Pass that baby off to somebody else.
But now that we understand how those loops can be closed and how we can manage them, the ultimate advantage of this is in that take, make, waste thing, you inevitably end up with CAFOs closer and closer to where the grass was grown. That's why all the CAFOs used to be in Chicago. They moved to Omaha and Kansas City, and then they moved to West Texas and Western Kansas. But here, the inevitable advantage of this system is when you can get the cow and the grass and the soil working together right there in the pasture,
right?
Then and it's an unbeatable advantage, right? Because now there's no way a CAFO in the long run can compete with the closed cycle that's operating on every acre everywhere all the time. Because it would have to take the manure from the feed yard, load it in trucks, and send it back out to the pasture. And it wouldn't be able to graze it just the same with all the great benefits that were going on. So what we're really doing, I think, is kind of moving to that point of ultimate advantage where we can get that loop working directly within itself.
It's so great. As Francis says, my cows, they go and they harvest their own feed. They spread their own fertility. they make their way back, and they really enjoy their work.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Yeah, they
just,
do. They really do.
it's just terrific. Well,
I don't know,
so
Bob, if you've ever done it. Just next time you're out in Francis's pasture, and I know Francis pretty well, but I've never been out to his farm. Look at the birds. So
oh,
sometimes it's hard to tell, but stand at a fence line and see what happens. And I think you'll see that, or if you ask Francis, he'll say, "Oh yeah, my pasture's alive with life that my neighbors just don't have."
absolutely. And see, that is the ultimate, I think the ultimate level of hope and aspiration and expectation, that natural systems can recover very quickly. We just have to start doing things in a more profoundly natural way. And this closing these loops and making these
Right.
cycles run at an optimum speed, if you will, is just working with nature. And we do that, nature responds, and things get
Yeah, nature does respond very, very quickly.
very quickly. I mean, stunningly quickly. So
Yeah, and the key is, like you said, it's working with the forces of nature. We're working with the natural ecosystem.
right.
Unintentionally, most of us didn't frame it that way. Some people did. Really, since the Enlightenment, we kind of saw our role as humans to conquer nature, to whip her into submission. And that kind of worked for a while, as long as we had the assets of nature that she had done before that, before we
Really
ruined it.
us.
And now we're kind of running out of that. I think the future of humanity, to me, is very hopeful, because I think, we know enough about this to do this. Francis could teach his neighbors tomorrow if his neighbors want to learn. It's complicated only in the extent it requires that you observe and learn and stop following recipes. And that you got to get out of that take, make, waste mindset, which is harder than it looks.
Well, yeah, because when you're built in it, we locked in an incumbent system, I had a really phenomenal, Reginaldo Hasamarakeen.
Yeah, I know, Ray.
Phenomenal life with Bob, on the level of what we heard tonight from Rehi. And when I was up there, I made another little funny video, tromping around with him feeding chickens. We did the whole cycle. And he makes exactly the point that you make. Your 3x or 5x stocking rate, which means the density of cattle, in an acre, and then the average daily gain. He said CAFO agriculture, or the modern agriculture, is extraordinarily efficient mechanically,
right,
and unbelievably inefficient in terms of the actual amount you get from all of that mechanical efficiency. Said if, on the other hand, you stack starting from deep in the soil up into the atmosphere above the soil, and you go
right,
from the tops of the trees to the tips of the roots and down below, and you look at that as the system that you're dealing with, then he said, listen, here we are feeding chickens by hand, putting chicken feed in a feeder. He said those guys would laugh at us. But look at what comes from this chicken, sunflower, hazelnut ecology, the most astounding level of productivity.
Right.
When you're looking at expanding your production from a linear, sort of a two-dimensional, to a big, huge three-dimensional, system that goes from the air down deep into the soil.
Yeah, I finally got to see Rahi's place. I was up there in June, and it was a joy. And I think it's exactly what you described. I think that all of this, back to that 50,000-mile view of Earth, if you just see energy coming in from out there, and you think, how can I stack things down here where I'm at that capture the most of what's out there? And then if you really look at, start in the soil with the microbes, they're cycling tiny, their life cycle is millimeters upon millimeters, right? But then there's slightly bigger insects and organisms, and they keep getting bigger and bigger. And you've got the chickens, and, where I'm working now in cattle over large land are just larger organisms. But, life doesn't do anything in single monocultures. Life does things in layers.
Yeah.
And only our engineering mind tried to say there's an acre of land and it does one thing. You know, are you growing corn or are you growing soybeans? Are you producing chicken or are you producing beef? And going to a rainforest is no different than a prairie. They're rich and diverse in life because they've figured out how to allow life to capture every layer of that system to maximize that capture of incoming energy. That's what life is doing.
Well, it's just beautiful. Terry Johnson's good friends with Paul Willett, I think, Willis, who started Diamond Ranch. Paul has a farm in northeastern Iowa, I think up around Mason City. And what he did is on his acreage, he just pulled all the drain tile out and let the water do what it did. All this, over time, native, flora, native flowers and plants that had been either extinct or not, not common at all.
Right.
All of a sudden they were back.
Right.
And then all of a sudden wildlife that everyone thought was extinct or gone, it was back.
Right.
And even in our 12 acres by the Eco Barn, south of Eco Village, you go there and you go into a conventional field and there's not much insect life, man. You go past the mint on the way into the Eco Barn. It's like this buzzing cornucopia of tens and tens, I'm sure hundreds of different varieties of insects. So my eyes can't discern, pick them up. I saw meadowlarks there. I haven't seen a meadowlark on a fence post here for the longest time. And so I think to finish up tonight, we have something with this model that creates profound hope. And not just hope, not empty hope, but hope based on really super sophisticated science, which we need to really actually appreciate and understand nature, at least in our culture. Ancient cultures just took nature at her word and just kind of went with it. We sort of need that in order to interpret and understand, but now we've got both, right?
Yeah, I think it is both. I think there was much wisdom in the ancient cultures that we failed to appreciate for sure. And we know enough from our own experience now how to make these things work. I think science has to change its seating in the car, if you will, instead of being, if our mental model was, man fighting nature, and we need to shift to working with nature, science ought to help us explain and understand so we can work with her better. So our science moves from being interventional science, like how can we genetically engineer something to do what we want it to do, to being observational science, which is how can we measure and understand so we can help her do it better. So I think there's plenty of room for science to help us advance this, but I don't think we need to have the science to make it happen. We've got enough practical experience and the wisdom of the ages to guide us back on the right path if we have the courage and wisdom to take it.
On that exceptionally beautiful note, Russ Conser, thank you very much for being with us. This was just a real joy. And I think what we'll do is we'll stop the Facebook feed, but here we are. Okay, so good. So we have, I've been looking at I'm monitoring my Facebook feed, and there's a lot of people wow, pages and pages of people enjoying our presentation. So yeah, so we'll get you back in a couple months, and in the meantime, maybe we'll have Francis come on. Almost, without me planning it, this is kind of moving in a kind of a regenerative energy and regenerative agriculture. But we do economics. I mean, Life with Bob.
They're all connected.
That kind of mimics my life. A lot of different domains.
Yeah, I think it's all connected. That's what we have to do, right? We unintentionally went through an era where we got better and better at managing pieces and forgot how the pieces fit together.
Yeah.
And now putting things back together, we find that they actually fit together really well. And some of these fundamental things, like I said, both as crazy as it sounds, fossil fuel production and renewable energy production and food production, in my view, are part of a common system. They're an energy system. They're the metabolism of Earth. So I'm, yeah, I mean, there's a million ways that we'll be able to go with it. So I look forward to seeing Francis as well.
Beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you very much, all. Thank you, everyone in Facebook land, for joining us. And Russ, stay with me. I'm just going to stop the live stream. So we'll see you next week when we have Mandar Apti is going to be our guest. Mandar worked in Russ's unit for years and years. When I first met him, he says, "Oh, Bob, you must meet my former boss, Russ Conser. He's amazing." I said, "Okay."
Mandar's pretty amazing himself. So
introduced me. So Mandar has gone off to create worldwide peace movements and working with the LAPD and many other organizations to bring techniques. You know, I practice TM. There's lots of ancient Vedic wisdom, particularly on how to allow our mind to settle down and become more profoundly natural. Part of, you know, kind of returning to this respect for nature by becoming a little bit more natural ourselves. And so we're going to hear from Mandar next week. So I hope you can join us, Russ, as a participant on Facebook. And
it'll be a joy. Mandar is a special person.
Yeah, he really is. And so we'll see you next time. Okay. Take care, folks. Bye-bye. Okay. That was cool.
It worked?
That was totally great. Totally. Great.
Hopefully I didn't put people to sleep. Again, I tried to time about 20, 25 minutes of information.
It was spectacular. It was absolutely spectacular. It was just exactly right. Just exactly right. Yeah. And so next time, we can dive now that we've allowed people to kind of assimilate this and just kind of axiomatically said some of these things are true. Let's go back and do a little bit deeper dive, you know, into how all this stuff really happens and kind of tell them what we told them this time. This stuff needs to be said again and again and again and again, Russ. And if I have a role, it's just somehow having the good karma or the good sense to keep my eyes open and find people and then be able to structure stuff like this so we get the stuff out in the world.
Yeah, well, I think it's get it out in the world and hopefully it sticks in a few of the right places. I guess it doesn't have to stick anywhere or everywhere.
Well, you know, Sharon Starr and I decided we would do a meeting, a Shackley meeting here with the goal of getting 100 families to use green cleaners.
Okay.
So we had the meeting. I thought before the meeting, this is when Roger Barnett just bought the company, young billionaire at that point, billionaire by his own making. And so this was in 2006, I think. And so before the meeting, I said, Roger, it's not all, I mean, it's fine to get people to use green cleaners. That's better than not using green cleaners. But would you come to the meeting and talk to the people about how Shackley became the first carbon neutral company in the world? I said, sure. And so I piped him into the meeting on my cell phone. There were only 16 people. I thought we'd have a full house. There were like 16 people there, right? But guess who one of them was? The mayor.
Okay.
He got so excited that we spent a year putting this together. And then we created the Go Green Commission that I was co-chair of.
Oh, that's how the Go Green thing started, huh?
That's how it started. It started with Sharon and I doing a meeting at the library. Roger blowing Ed's mind by spending an hour with people in Fairfield, Iowa, talking about what we'd done. And so, you know, yeah, as they say, you never know.
You never know. Well, I hope we get some interesting questions coming out of the conversation we had tonight.
I definitely think we will. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to close up here and just hit go on the watch party. And I did that on Stewart's last night and had 94 people.
Wow. Cool.
So, okay, brother. Thank you.
Great.
Bless you.
Pleasure talking to you, Bob.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.